Good morning, everybody. It's nice seeing a lot of familiar faces. Some of these faces, we've been coming to conferences like this for the last 15 plus years. And it's nice seeing it because that means we're hanging in there. We're working on the common values and that vision of a more resilient grid, a more resilient industrial control system, a system that is more protected, yet at the same time, more able to be brought back into the systems that provide the critical infrastructures that we all know and love. So with that, I'm going to ask Mike to tell you why we think ICSs and his background and experiences are so important, and then I'll throw in a little for myself.
All right. Just as kind of a bit of background, I've been an engineer in this particular space for about 13 years. I started off doing regulatory compliance and things like that in electric power. Kind of fell in love with electric power, didn't quite realize that it even existed while I was growing up. Electric infrastructure was in the background to me, and that's changed over my life, and kind of having an understanding now of what we see as important, as well as as what we don't quite realize is important, has really changed me in that regard. For me, I'm me right now. I'm working with DARPA in partnership with DOE on this rapid attack detection, isolation, and characterization systems. And the DOE partnership is with Liberty Eclipse, which is a multi-year exercise series, which is focused on recovery and restoration of the electric power grid, information sharing, as well as bringing together all of the individual entities and government entities and public and private entities who are responsible for that. And so I've been working on that partnership with DARPA and with DOE over the past year on this.
And I'm Gary Seifert. I put about 35 years in at the National Lab System. I worked at the Idaho National Laboratory. I started out as a power electrical engineer, and then about 15 years ago, I had to take a left turn and jump into the cyber world because the lab started the SCADA testbed, and they wanted power system engineers who also had experience in control systems. And fortunately, I was there and I was available, and I helped them start that. Since then, it's been a roller coaster for the last 15 years because cyber seems to be becoming more and more part of our life, and more a part of our embedded knowledge and capabilities that we have to do. So with that, I just want to make one quick claim. Mike and I are up here talking about our personal observations of what we saw during the exercise. We're not representing either DOE or DARPA officially. We're just up there as two control system engineers having a lot of fun in the cyber world. We all know why we're here. Every day we see more and more impacts on our energy system. Over the last 5 to 7 years, we've seen targeted systems going after our electrical systems, our petroleum systems, our gas systems, our water systems, our sewer systems. It's becoming more and more obvious that it is going to be an impact if we ever have a hostile impact, or the bad guys that want money from us start getting even more effective at their ransomwares and their other processes that we're worried about. But there's a lot of obstacles there too. I mean, what utility, what petroleum company wants to put all of their investment money into cyber? They have competing resources. They have energy improvements they're doing. They have the cyber improvements they're doing. They have the control systems improvements. There's just a lot of things going on that are taking money away from the critical features here. So it's a balancing act, and we understand that. One of the reasons I'm involved in this is because DoD said we have to have power on our critical facilities to ensure that our people come to those critical facilities and take care of them. Because when you have to make a decision of staying home in a blacked out neighborhood and taking care of your family versus going to work and taking care of the critical facility for national value, it's a tough decision. So by bringing power back rapidly around those critical facilities, has become a DoD need, and that's where the DARPA radix programs grew out of. With that, we did a little bit of research, and we found out that utilities really have a pretty good idea what Black Start is. They have plants they've designated. They have plans to bring them up and bring their islands back up. But what they don't have is the ability to test that black start scenario, because you can't take the grid down. You can't really do that kind of an exercise. So what do we see? We see an awful lot of tabletop exercises,
Yep.
and tabletop exercises are never the end result when you're actually trying to do something new. And recovering from a cyber attack is really something new that the utilities have really not exercised nor tested in their past.
And so for my perspective, working with the Department of Energy on here, all right, Radix provided a real interesting and kind of unprecedented capability to do some of this ground level cyber response and recovery work on a replica grid, not a simulation, not something that you would throw up on a monitor somewhere, not a one line itself, but actual real physical hardware that transmits voltage and current, all right, with all of the systems. And we'll get more into that a little bit later, but this was unprecedented to be able to work with and observe and see how all of the different people, all right, the people and the processes would interface with the technology in order to enable black start, in order to enable restoration after a significant cyber event.
So what is a black start? Everybody has an idea, but the reality is in a black start, you have to have a generation asset that starts. Big generators do not start by themselves. A large generator needs about 10 to 15% of its nameplate just to start. So in a black start scenario, utilities start with small generators in your neighborhoods. They run them through small substations in your neighborhoods. They jump on small transmission or distribution networks that leave your neighborhoods and go to larger neighborhoods or to industrial areas, and eventually to a larger area of transmission where other generation assets can be combined together or synchronized. We call that a crank path. And the program that I've been working on basically does a situation awareness. It's detect and detect the attack. Where did it come from? How many components have been affected, and where are we going with that? Then you have the isolation function, the secure emergency network function, and then you have the characterization and cleanup. But the one thing I want to re-emphasize multiple times today is that what we've learned in the last couple of years of attacks in other soils is that the utilities find out that they have a hard time trusting, or the petroleum companies have a hard time trusting. One of the things that we talked about last year at S4 was the Triconics thing, and the year before that was the Ukraine thing. What did the utility find? One simple malware took out multiple devices, many more than they had spares for. So they ended up having to go to manual operation. But the key is even after they came back up, they didn't know what to trust. They didn't know how far the infections had got, how bad the malwares had got, whether they're going to get reinfected. And so that part of that characterization is critical because you have to build trust. If we had a nationwide outage, we would have many relays and many RTUs and many RTACs that would be compromised. Many of them can be recovered. But how do you trust that recovered device, and how do you put it back into play?
And so from my perspective, working on this project and working on this partnership, one of the more interesting features of this is that DARPA definitely took a plugs out, everything is down, everything is completely owned, everything is completely unelectrified at this particular point. It's been a couple days. And yes, this is the adverse situation, but the capability that they're attempting to build with these tools, all right, and with this test bed that they're working on, allows testing of everything up to and including that. And so we can actually take a look at it, and we can see the process that we would follow, not just for this catastrophic event, but also for varying other types of events as well. Smaller malware, smaller attacks, things that don't quite bring down the grid, things that don't have the secondary effects that Gary was talking about, where you don't have electricity to a large area for a while. And so this capability is helpful here because it works across the whole stack.
And remember, we're trying to do this with a 7-day after we've been called, because the utilities already figured out that they don't quite have the depth of the tools or the spares to get there. And then they've tried it for days and days and days. We're not their first go-to, but we hope not to be their last go-to. But the reality is we're trying to do that with a 7-day restoral process. broken the research of the program down into 5 key areas. The first one's situation awareness, and that situation awareness allows the isolation to start in the most impacted areas. And that situation awareness is looking at things other than the internal networks of the utility.
And this is really important from an operations perspective. If they don't have situational awareness, if they don't know where current's flowing, they don't know where voltage is, they don't know what breakers are open or closed at this point, they literally cannot do work. They cannot restore the system because they don't know where the system is. All right, there's a set of plans for this, there's a set of procedures for this, but if you don't know what's out there and what its current settings are, you're done. Yeah. And situational awareness often means rolling crews, it means getting SCADA back up to speed, maybe it means out of band. So incredibly important first thing you do when you arrive at a situation like this.
And you don't know where the attack's been. The attack could have been in the relays, it could have been on the RTACs, it could have been at the SCADA system, or it could have been even in the communication system. So step one, once you show up, is an interesting step. The first step we observed was, if you've been out of power for a long time, your substations have no power. The batteries are dead. The first thing the linemen have to do is fire up the generator on their truck and get the batteries started. Once the batteries are up and running, then you start bringing the systems back one at a time. The first system you typically bring back is your comm system. How do you communicate situation awareness or status on that remote device without communications?
And as a point to Gary, we haven't said cyber once for this slide. All right, cyber responders aren't even here in general because we're still dealing with some of the nuts and bolts that would happen in a normal, natural disaster type situation. All right, this hasn't even become a cyber issue yet. It's getting power to the systems that we then need to go and recover.
So to have an effective test bed, though, you have to have these functionalities built in. And that was an observation that came back to me in spades because I saw the same thing that I saw back at the Idaho lab 15 years ago. If you don't have real components, you can't really do real research and effective research on how to restore those components. So your network isolation piece is an outgrowth of that. So how do we create a secure network can work in the presence of malware? Once you have that secure network up and running, then you can push to the next stage, which is characterization. Where have the bad people put their badness? Is it in the firmware memory? Is it in the RTUs? Is it a reset of the relay settings? Is it a complete bricking of a device? So once you characterize things, and it's more than just pushing the button and then going through the screen, you truly have to look in those devices and find out what's going on.
All right, and so this partnership, all right, from my perspective, when we went into this partnership, all right, this is where, you know, I'm from the government and I'm here to help is actually true. All right, so imagine for a moment, okay, that you're doing this type of work, you're pulling this sort of information off of these devices by whatever means necessary or through the radix tools themselves that are being developed. You get this to someone, all right, a set of specialists, a set of experts, all right, potentially from government, potentially from outside, and you get this information to them, and we figure out, okay, how far did it go? How did it infect the system? What's the level of infection? Do we need to worry about when we reset it, is it going to stay persistent? And that kind of threat characterization goes from the utility level and the ground level all the way up, potentially up to government, potentially up to third parties, potentially up to ICS CERT, potentially to other organizations, and then comes back down again is the idea. And being able to have the opportunity to exercise that, which is something I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to do in the future, was a really big deal.
Well, and that starts to show the value of having other than a tabletop exercise, because a tabletop exercise is not necessarily going to give you all those features, but it sure is not going to give you that interaction between the multiple agencies and the multiple decision layers that happen at the utilities. You know, once you do that, you can, now we'd like to maybe visit with you about some of the real world components that we pulled together and the value that those components brought to that research feature. In the exercises, it was a multi-day thing. It was 7 days of you know what, because I can't use that word here. But the reality is it was 7 days where each day we had a major challenge to overcome. And the first challenge we had on day one was a system that was truly out of commission. It was multiple utilities with multiple control systems and multiple devices that were all impacted by the effects of what a malware might do to that device. So if you brick a device, you're messing with the firmware. So we had all kinds of devices that were impacted by real-world events and real-world impacts and real-world effects, and they had the simulated characteristics of what a device should have after it was attacked, and without the infectious protocol would be brought with it.
All right, and from my perspective, this starts to look like a playbook. This starts to look like, in an event like this, when do you need cyber responders on site? What do they need to bring? What do they need to be prepared for? And logistics like that also needs to follow suit as well. And you have this playbook at this, catastrophic stage, this catastrophic black start scenario that DARPA's had. But there are also abilities to link that to other, like I said earlier, more minor events, all right, which kind of gives us an idea of what's expected once we bring cyber responders in and who they need to interface with and how they need to interface, as well as the organizational parts of this. So who makes some of these risk-based decisions? In a normal incident response in like a normal IT environment, everyone speaks the same language. Everyone understands, oh yes, that's a domain controller. It's an important piece of system, all right? This is a core router, all right? We should probably work on this first. But of course, in the utility space, they're gonna be going, well, no, I need substation 1 up. Because that's the one nearest to my generator. Go there first, get that system working, and then we'll move on to other ones. And that discussion, all right, that common verbiage, that common terminology doesn't always exist between power engineers, power operators, and computer security experts. And so we actually saw in several cases during the exercise that we did in November, all right, that we had to go through several quote unquote rounds of dumbing down in order for the two to talk to each other and then build up that trust again going forward.
Yeah, you can imagine the challenge when you have PhD Zoomies who are really, really good at counting bytes and bits in memory, working with linemen who came from the local utility 10 miles away, and their idea of a tough tool is that 40-pound wrench that they have to use to get up the pole on the line truck.
Yeah,
so
we'll
it's
just
two
use
different
percussive.
worlds, and we had to bring them together during the process.
We'll just use percussive maintenance on it. Exactly. Who needs bits and bytes?
So in the process of the 7 days of you-know-what, we started at the bottom, just like Mike mentioned. You start at the generation asset and you work your way forward. But at the same time, you cannot exercise all of your time on one or two problems. So you truly have to triage the system. You have to find a way to get a path through from generation to distribution to transmission and get all those pieces up and running. And more importantly, you have to start getting situation awareness back to the utility perspective. One of the things that impressed me the most in the last exercise was the dependence on immediate restoral of voice communications. In a large-scale outage, you're going to come in after the cell phones have all run out of juice, after the radios quit working, after the fiber's down, after the comms down. And the first thing we try to do is get that realism back with the test range of having voice come back in over a secure methodology. So that was a really big learning lesson that I saw. So we did a pilot based upon on an island. It truly was an island. So one of the things we were asking the utility partners is how do you do things? They says, well, we bring generation up into an island, and then that island connects to another island. And we've got researchers who live in very big cities. Their idea of an island is the barrier around New York, right? The reality in the utility business is islands are electrical islands, and those electrical islands only connect over a few points. Those points have to be the points where power is interchanged and power is synchronized, or it's not. And one of the things you have to do in a restoral, especially after a cyber incident, is number one, bring those back together, but be able to trust your instruments. Because if you can't trust your instruments, you're not going to bring things together out of sync, because badness happens when you bring two generators together out of sync. And we're doing this with the same synchronizers that the utilities themselves are using. That 27 device exists on a lot of different brands of relays and a lot of different brands of generation control relays and control systems and control, and then there's also the digital controls on the generator. So pulling all those things together to make these two systems come together was an interesting challenge. On this island, which is Plum Island out at the end of Long Island, we created two complete utility standalone systems. Each utility standalone system had a generator. It had distribution breakers, it had transmission networks between the two, and it had transmission components. We were lucky that the Homeland Security folks on the island were gracious enough to sever their system in half. They kept their critical systems down at the south end of the island. We got the north end of the island. And that allowed us to have this dual utility test bed that allowed us to do an exercise on cyber recovery rather than black start only.
All right, and when it comes down to actual recovery pieces, you might think you're in charge as a cyber responder, and you're not. The operator's in charge, all right? They are the ones who make the decisions on risk. They're the ones who make the decisions on what equipment gets energized and when. They're the ones who determine when you get to enter a substation if you have to do manual work on a system. All right, so these two utility ops centers were both staffed with volunteer utility operators, folks from industry who came and gave their time for 7 days. They gave their time, they gave their experience, all right, and they gave their comments at the end of this on what else was necessary for this exercise in order to get more realistic, to get more effective. And having that capability, having actual utility operators saying, well, why do I need this tool? All right, tell me what I need. All right, tell me this. I need to have an understanding of this particular component. These other things are interesting, but that's my focus now. Was incredibly valuable, all right, especially for future exercises.
It was also interesting watching a young pup that was really good at cyber say, I'm going to change your relay password. And the utility lineman in the shop said, no, but you know what? No, okay? And it was watching that dynamics. And the reality is in a response, the people interactions are going to be just as critical as the cyber recovery, as the hardware recovery, as the actual process of bringing a black start together.
And so the organizational structure here is working in this partnership. I think that this organizational structure is one of the pieces that really needs to be really well examined in the future. We may have these tools. These tools may be the best tools in the world. They may hammer nails really fast and screw in screws really quick, all right, and it might hold when you're done. But if you don't know where to use them and when, and to do it correctly, and correctly is a big piece of this, because we are working on things that have physical consequences. And so you can't have someone go into a substation and pull the firmware directly off of a device or reflash the firmware on a device without everyone in that organization, that organizational structure, that response and recovery structure, knowing exactly what you're doing and exactly what those consequences are, and knowing exactly who that gets approved from. Because it's not just restoring from backup at this point, all right? It's not just sending someone out with a spare switch at this point. We're talking about potentially systems that are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars,
or more,
millions of dollars, irreplaceable in the near term. So these kinds of decisions have to be made correctly, and we need to determine that organizational structure ahead of time. And that's one of my personal key focuses over the next year and a half with Radix.
Now, one of the key features we started out with is that we wouldn't be creating the state-of-the-art tool. We're going to be using the tools of the people in the audience, but in an automated way that works together and allows this process to work more rapidly, more automatically. And that was key to me, because then you're not dependent on one brainiac with one idea to really determine the success of the program. It's really that process and that automation, that use of tools intelligently, that use of tools that met that 7-day recovery goal and actually brought the grid back up quicker than if you'd done it a different way. To do that, a key word is relevance. You have to be relevant to the industry that that is in process here. That's the utility industry. So to do that, it had to have relevant and realistic and representative components and configurations. Now, granted, you can't build a several hundred kV transmission system with hundreds of miles. You can't do that. But you can have systems that have relevant functions that are scalable up in voltage and up in power without any change in those cyber processes and conveniences. So in the exercise, there were two utilities. Each had its own generator. Each had multiple substations with multiple modern electronic relays that are the target of the malware things we talked about earlier.
And go ahead.
Each one of them has a control system, a SCADA system, because situational awareness is critical. People manage the systems from control centers, often hundreds of miles away. They need that voice communication. They need that situation awareness coming out. They need to know which breaker's open, which breaker's closed, and they need to be able to trust that information coming in from the field.
Right, and one of the benefits of having a very diverse set of control systems, so I think we had how many vendors as far as control systems go? Not names, but...
Not names. We have probably 5 of the 7 most common units out there, and we got the other 2 on the wings if everybody masters those.
So being able to be out on this diverse set of systems, all right, there is no standard way to pull debug information from an electric power relay. It just doesn't exist. Each one is different. Each one has its own quirks, as well as setting it up, as well as determining what logic is running, how to compare that logic to the old running logic to see if anything new has been added. And so this diversity is an issue that we're actually going to see if this were to happen in the real world. And once again, full stack, all right? Even minor events up to the major ones are going to have this issue with equipment diversity. And after being at well over 30 substations over the course of my career, equipment diversity is all over the place. Many different firmwares, many different makes, models, all right, system configurations. These are different things that a responder may not know going into it that has to be communicated to them. Again, people, process, technology.
So a quick review by the numbers. 3 SCADA systems, 3 different sets of communication protocols. We've got 15 different RTUs or RTACs. We've got 3 different types of communication protocols, things you would normally see, whether it's a serial system on a bulk electric system or a DMP3 system on a system that's using an IP-based communication process. We've got 7 different relay models with 3 different brands in there and 2 more on the wings. We've got all kinds of communication routers and switches that are running the systems and the protections and the firewalls that you would normally see in a utility. All to do one thing, to support a test system that starts from generation, goes up through an island, connects through a synchronizable point, and allows the cyber response team to get through these 30 or 40 different malware tests or test effect payloads that make these devices look like something that has been attacked, and allow the triage and the cleanup and the trust mechanisms to be reestablished.
All right, and one of the other pieces that you may notice on this particular diagram, which is a one-line diagram of the system that we used on Plum Island, or that was used on Plum Island. We were a part of it. We is a big we. We also have something called a critical load, all right, and we have 2 critical loads for the specific system for this specific exercise. You don't restore power in a vacuum, all right? You're not just restoring power for the fun of restoring power. All right, yes, you want to make money, you're a business, if you were here yesterday for Patrick Miller's talk. But the other piece is you're providing power to things which do other things, which enable society to function. And so as part of this exercise, as part of the artificiality of the exercise, yes, but was necessary, is that we gave the utilities orders and we said, hey, you must keep this particular load online. It needs to be up within a certain amount of time. It needs to stay up for a certain amount of time. And you do what you need to do in order to make that happen while working with your cyber responders. That critical load could be anything, all right? We didn't give them any direction on what it was. It could be a military facility, it could be a hospital, it could be Washington, D.C., all right? It could be a large LNG terminal. It doesn't matter because we're there to bring power to it. That's our function. And if cyber response and recovery doesn't support that function, then we need to find a way to make sure that it can.
So in summary, real pieces, relevant research, the ability to bring the power grid back more rapidly, and the ability to support critical missions and critical aspects. Last thing I want to do is warn you that there's a guy out there by the name of Andrew Wampat, who's the DARPA representative.
Stand up,
look
Andrew.
him up and ask him all the questions you want on DARPA. Thank you very much.